Ranging from mild discomfort to flat out nope to the power of infinitum, there isn't a soul in this realm that hasn't been tainted and painted by the fear brush. Matter of fact, I'd be willing to bet that on a scale of 1 to 10, there are many, many more with a double-digit fix served with all the sprinkles than those who stand alone with a take it or leave it mindset. Isn't that interesting? It certainly makes me think, because if the game is mental, that means it's fought in your head via thoughts and perceptions and your interaction with these energetics. What I'm saying is they are your fears. Really let that sink into the depths of your perception and down to the core belief level. Because what springs from this is an immense sense of empowerment when you comprehend that the game plays out inside your awareness. Imagine it like this. If silence was scared of the song, it would miss the best part of the performance it makes possible as it strives to avoid that which it can't ignore and thus must deal with. Feel that within. Not just the words and text, but the somatic sense it builds. Make it rich, sensual. Is the quiet fluffy and the sound sharp and violent in comparison? What are their colors? Explore the resonance. That's like the zone of comfort to which we run and then wonder why magic never seems to come or manifest. Matter of fact, Hollywood and the rest of its front organizations like education and politics thrives on this and depends upon your ignorance to butter the bread you're force-fed even though you are gluten and dairy intolerant. Did you know that both of these things create an opiate-like effect inside your head that makes it really hard to quit? That which provides a small slice of comfort in a world that feels 2 steps from hell, but with pretty decent window dressing designed to keep the stench of fear well hid under a thin veneer of socialization and tricks that lead to all in this realm wearing masks that deny they are mere fragments of themselves. And the alpha and omega of this mix? Fear itself. Everybody has a regret, a time they recollect with an effortlessness which pitches a vivid image in your head along with the matching somatic sensations like shortness of breath, your shoulders scrunching, and maybe your brow as well, whilst your throat gets tense and the thin bead of sweat makes its presence felt via weak knees, arms heavy, and a mind that automatically offers spaghetti as the next link. Sometimes you got to lose yourself in order to come to your senses about the true nature of this illusion in which we are currently manifest and taught to believe we are human. Isn't it interesting that the spell I just spit also has another meaning which links quite well with the start of this section and the entire topic? It also means a legal action, which means one wavelength with many modes of resonance, none of which you created, but all you accepted without question when they were pumped into your head at a time you were impressionable, trying to make sense of a world that seemed frighteningly magnificent as you were surrounded by those who no longer felt quite as fresh and vivid themselves, as they were far distanced from the gift of the present moment, and thus adulterated. And to think, in terms of emotional richness and strength, fear was most probably the wavelength you were most familiar with in terms of its relative resonance and the way it overwhelmed your senses. Like a cloud of darkness that quietly draped over the light music that kept you distracted by its non-stop chatter and impressions that never end via that voice in your head that you aren't, but think you are, because that's what Simon says. For all you know, and know you don't, there is a much larger part of this you won't admit, and thus place off limits. I call it what you don't know you don't know. It's a dark side of the moon thing, because there is a wax and a wane that slides between a light and dark that is reflected, But the flip of this contains, well, haven't you wondered? I do, still, and did, once upon a when. See, I know fear in a way that most people will never, ever make its acquaintance, because it's been my royal, loyal friend since before I stepped in and donned the skin around my infinite awareness that was split like a tree laden with fruit that was stripped of its offerings before having its leaves trimmed, and then its branches were hacked to bits before the trunk was axed and the roots fully ripped from the ground that sustained them. So all that's left is a seed, an acorn of remembrance, a glimmer of potential, a fractal expression of the all of everything that was flipped turned upside down upon itself and then launched into a realm modulated via the five senses that peer at a tiny, tiny selection of the electromagnetic spectrum from which they stitch together a narrative, and are then held hostage by the voice in their head that uses their fears as a weapon to ensure that they always dwell within the cell of the mind-made prison that has bars invisible, but are, nonetheless, felt by every single soul in this realm, on a scale of 1 to 10, with most weighing in as emotionally body positive, but trying hard to pretend they're perfectly supermodel thin, and or curvaceous, or whatever else isn't them, but is programmed in by this realm as what is not only accepted, but expected, and anything less is a mess that is not inherently attractive. You can consider all of this from the inverted tree of the false self from which we eat thanks to nibbling the Venusian riddle that prevents hidden inside both the orbit and the fruit itself, as well as the crooked trick that intends to insert Siri into your iris as we become transhuman and prep for the next level, with the credit of our soul being dropped into what I'll call techno-sapiens when carbon and silicon mix. How wild is this? Without fear, nobody would accept this, but with it, it seems so attractive. Kind of like how people are going to look back at this immense period of self-hatred in this realm, where no one can accept themselves as they are, and then yell at others for not sanctioning their madness by buying into the image they project. Tell me this world isn't crazy. Matter of fact, rate that on a scale of 1 to 10, with the single digit being a range of people who know their self and energetics so well they are capable of manifesting things that regular people wouldn't comprehend. But let's say they effortlessly breathe 2 times a minute with optimal blood oxygenation, thanks to not possessing an immense belt of tension that winds its invisible grip around their neck, chest and abdomen, as well as their eyes, mouths and forehead as well, and 10 being those who are unaware of what I've just said, but having it run their awareness via a voice in their head, which at this very moment is trying to discount what you just read, because if you click this, then the jig is up. And a game with no players is an empty dimension, like a box that could contain a kitten, except there was no pussy within. As without perception, there is naught but potential. The end. Before it even begins. That is how powerful your awareness is. Really let that sink in and see how far you can follow it to its depths, and maybe you too will hear the silence. Because when you do, I'd be interested in hearing what is said and how your trip notes compare and contrast to my experience, as we all bring our own perspective and bias, which mistranslates the message due to our own judgment. That is how powerful your awareness is. With a silken effortlessness, a world was pulled over your head like a cowl that scowls with a veiled thread of darkness, as you were set upon by 3 hooligans that we shall call thought, emotion, and action. If you stop and think about it, it's often this trio that leave their sig upon the checks of time you are then pledged to honor by the board as you serve your life sentence in the flesh, swimming in ignorance of these principles as you've been trained to thunk that stars and earthbound celebs are one and the same thing, when, in reality, only one of these is authentic, but both need a witness to exist. Like I said, Hollywood weaves spells. And like that tree that was stripped back down to its most basic essence, your awareness was fragmented so they could take this negative space and fill it with things that don't exist. Much like a kid intuits that if you close your eyes, it doesn't exist, aka withdraw your awareness from this realm and the one who built it in darkness with no guidance or admonishment as he created his footrest with a little help from his friends. Actually, let's get back to them. Thought, emotion, and action were three good kids that came up in a place 2 bus stops from hell. It didn't take them long for them to get corrupted into perverted thought, desiring emotion, and destructive action who took the helm, and, in effect, they possessed the original inner sense with a state of adulteration that deviated so far from their blueprint that they turned to kill that which gave them life. Much like humans on this planet, which is chocked to the gills with xenoestrogens and microplastics that exert their quiet influence in a long con of terraforming humans via the steady degradation of their environment in the quest to acquire more newly printed bills that are backed by nothing else than people's investment in what they rep, as they mistake the map for the destination and thus miss that true wealth springs from within, which is why the system built over it. And they installed a plumbing rig that sends you a bill for the pleasure of drinking the waters they've filled with a perfect balance of trace level toxins designed to ensure you are steadily poisoned by what you are consuming as a form of sustenance. Social media and the press are 10 times worse than this and a billion times less subtle, but flicking back again to the 1 to 10 insane human scale, I bet you can imagine that those who live in the transcendent awareness of innocence that isn't adulterated with bands of tension that skew their perceptions to taint their presence via a process I've termed the pain body, named so because you see through it, and thus it's invisible, until you comprehend that if they could, they'd charge you to breathe the air, which is no different from getting a water bill, is it? So, these 3 kids let him have it, Chris, and killed the one who gave them sentience. You. They are your fears, as all of this plays out inside your awareness. Ergo, you are another me, and I am thee from another lens, because we are made of the self-same thing that every religion is chasing and science dreams of cavorting with. The 0 point of origin, the prime, the pre-existing, that has many names and labels, but will never be found in any temple, mosque, or establishment man-built, as they are simply tools of oppression, repression, and dividing under the guise of unification to provide conflict. Just like the net, yes? So, you can pretend these 3 form the dimensions that birth the flesh you're currently wearing, whilst being hooked on phonics and carrying an acorn of potential within that most, from start to end, will never stop and examine. Those who plant and water it with their attention are far less. Can you see why I've said that this realm is a living hell for those who still dwell in inner sense? All it took was a near constant series of assaults on my frame since I stepped in to gain this awareness in the flesh, because when you've been scared to death, the only thing that comes next is to dare to live once again, because the only way out of this realm needs you to balance the equation. Ergo, you cannot leave with any more or less than you stepped in with. 100% pure confidence and total self-acceptance. With the intrinsic awareness, you are the most important person on the planet, and this entire place revolves around your presence. That's innocence in its most basic. The warrior aims to transcend adulteration by shaking off his programming and the collective hypnosis foisted upon the population and sustained using threats of life-ending events, near constant stress, and more distractions than your caveman energetics can handle, as you stay hypnotized by a black mirror that represents the planet Saturn that moves in a hexagram and thus links to Venus. Like I said, the stars tell me far realer tales than any of your fake celebs, but their well-timed deaths certainly send a message which is akin to a sacrifice to these ruffians, now 12 and counting, much like war and conflict. You ever wondered about all of those dead cows, pigs, and whatever else they told us needed to become burnt offerings for whatever reason? What about abortions as well, or is that a bridge too far for you to travail? Just like women's rights being the best thing for them, when in reality they're more oppressed now than they've ever been, as they get all the same stress and problems as modern men, but with no true friends or camaraderie in the rest, because women, first and foremost, compete amongst themselves, and thus chase delusions that were poured into their heads by shows that told them, yes, you can have your cake and stay thin without a Zimpic face kicking in, as Sex in the City did a number on their awareness. Wait till I tell you about those famous souls painted red and their true origin, because if you believe that wolf ticket, then you'll probably accept a fib that says that death and taxes are inevitable, as you swim in the seas of debt and think that getting ahead is best done by exchanging chains made of iron for those of platinum, so you too can warble like the cage bird sings, and avoid the simple truth buried under your coping mechs and various modes of avoidance. You are scared to death to live, because you were trained to place your strength outside yourself, which is in direct opposition to a fact you are welcome to reality test. This entire realm takes place inside your awareness. Here is how to check it. Imagine not existing. I mean, really invest in this. After a while, you'll find the concept ridiculous because it simply can't happen, as you are a fractal echo of the prime, the pre-existing. Even if you pretend not to be there, there is still something silently observing. This state I call the witness. You can further test the hypothesis by extending this concept to the you that sees visions inside their head in bed whilst dreaming and mistakes them for authentic before you rise into another illusion which is just as false but more constant. Reality, truly, is a trip in that sense, and I've had some funny old conversations with schizophrenics who said, "How come you feel like one of us but you look like one of them?" Magic, with a K, as that spell makes all the difference, as it's all about hypnosis in this realm. And whilst we will click how simple it is to make one hop around squawking and pretend they're a chicken, how few comprehend that 8 billion souls are present and firmly convinced they are human. Ain't that a wheeze? Player, can you spare some cheese and bread so I can get a hit of that queso morphine goodness? If not, I'm sure the net can frazzle my central nervous system with constant belts of stimulation as I swim in a toxic soup of chemicals they proudly say are forever, that exert their influence upon my perceptions on a subtle level that is aggregate and designed to create a sense of hate for ourselves and this realm and pretty much everything else, because victims like to blame whilst warriors spot their opponent's game and choose to grab the reins of their consciousness whilst living, because these 12 hungry demons I mentioned are nothing more and nothing less than our old friends, the symbols of the zodiac, which is why both Hitler and the US flapped those eagle wings, and Jesus said the drinks would be on him as the Son of God slid into the next house with a tail which shall link, a roaring lion of a man, who uplifts the oppressed as the water-bearer of higher consciousness, as they did with loaves and fish back when. Like I said, the stars have their own message. Are you listening? They are the programming language of this realm, and thus true artificial intelligence, which is making its presence felt via the carbon-based upgrades that are coming, because the game plays out inside your awareness. Ergo, they are your fears, thus strengths. If you accept this mission to be willing to get free or thrive trying, as I've been on this kick for many incarnations, and this is my last spin in this realm, so take a moment to listen. Reality test a little bit and tell me what happens, because I'm super selective with what and whom I give my attention, which is why no news is good news is exactly how I live. But it's always interesting to see what others discover within, with that little bit of guidance on how to speak body language in order to hear the silence the noise is currently hiding. Try jumping up and down. Just a subtle bounce, feet grounded, shaking all of your flesh for 10 minutes, then stand perfectly still for the same period and listen within. When you can, something very, very interesting will happen, as the pain body I mentioned will chip after a couple of months of practicing, and nothing will ever be the same again. Say hello to your inner sense, my friend. Let me tell you what happened to me, so you can make your comparison when you tap this wavelength of your awareness. Outside of my flesh, after I'd been doing this for extended periods with steadily increasing resonance that needed far less effort to manifest, I energetically met a state I call a pixum. A pixel of emotion that felt like a water droplet that was supercharged with awareness and recollection from which I'd disconnected and suppressed. I actually relived it. A full-on distortion of time-space, like I was a feathered serpent that was wormholing around the Van Allen belts at full clip to go back to the future of an event that felt as real and as vivid as you just noticing you are now breathing manually. "Don't you just hate it?" he said with a grin, as he proved the power of suggestion, because words are spells that influence your nervous system, that changes your consciousness into a loop that keeps false self-perpetuation, which is why you run like a gerbil in a cage in what they call the rat race, chasing bio-survival tickets on a planet of souls that are outsane, because being in is pretty decent, as they see the game how it is, which is why they label them schizophrenics and stick depot injections in their rear end, because back when, these same dudes would have been shamans, well versed in the realm beyond this, as they danced the song lines and spoke to the spirits that now torment them as they are medicated and psycho-raped to say they don't exist. Or else they'll double the pills and roll that fit with the long-armed jacket. Can you imagine, just for a bit, that you think that there are a group of people out to get you, and when you tell someone, they prove it by locking you up against your will and force-feeding you psychotropics in order to ensure your silence? There was an experiment, once upon a when, where students pretended, when presenting, to be insane to gain admission to an asylum, and then they carried on acting totally normal and handling their biz as regular people whilst waiting for them to click. Most of them didn't see the exit because the team were convinced that all they did was proof of their madness, like an inverted naked emperor thing. This is the power of spells when I'm telling you that, from my lens, these so-called schizophrenics raise some very interesting questions like, why can't you control that voice in your head? The actual only difference between you and them is you accept it as you without questions, and they comprehended they are something else listening to it, and then fragmented before being sucked away into a false self-reflecting fractal that bounces their awareness between this and a higher realm without a concrete state of centering from which to gain discernment. Much like lucid dreaming in that sense, because first you've got to click what that old nursery rhyme meant. Row, row, row your boat made of flesh, gently down the stream of consciousness. Merrily, 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 for fear is false evidence appearing real. Life is but a dream within a dream. It's a dark side of the moon thing, see? That's how it seems to me currently. So why not bounce with a fully body rhythm for 45 minutes at a belt until your pain body chips, and you too can beam your consciousness to this celestial event and read what was written on the part that was hidden and dressed in the flesh and skeleton of your fears you try to pretend don't exist. Till we meet again.